Hi all, this is the first of two what I'm going to refer to as wrap-up sessions or lessons. In both of these, I want to highlight what I consider to be a key cornerstone of the discipline of sociology, a notion developed by this gentleman, C. Wright Mills. It was the basis of the very first lesson, the sociological imagination or perspective. Remember what he implied by that. We are unique individuals, but we are significantly shaped and influenced by the social locations we occupy within society, as well as larger social factors. So the topic for this first wrap-up session is the relationship that exists between race on the one hand and intelligence on the other hand. To be specific, I want to focus on a book that was published in 1994, authored by Richard Hertzstein, who he died before the book was published. He's a psychologist by training, and Charles Murray, who is a political scientist. They began their book with an observation that I think most social scientists would accept without reservation. Society is marked by an increasing gap, with well-paid, highly educated elite at the top and a struggling, undereducated, and increasingly poor underclass below. But the authors, Hertzstein and Murray, go one step further and explain this equality to be the natural result of differences in intelligence. Needless to say, an assertion that generated quite a lot of controversy and debate, which is still going on today. In the early part of the book, Hertzstein and Murray highlight evidence which they argue underlies and supports some key assumptions about intelligence. And these are the ones in particular that they note. Take a moment and examine each one of them. Now, they came to these conclusions by and large through an analysis of findings from a study that began in 1979. It included a sample of over 12,000 whites, ages 14 to 22 years of age, and it followed them for many years. What were the results of the study? As a rule, participants with lower than average IQ scores tended to drop out of school, struggle holding jobs, had children outside of marriage, committed crimes, and ended up poor. On the other hand, as a rule, those with higher than average IQ scores enrolled and graduated from college, secured high-paying, high-status jobs, had stable marriages, and enjoyed affluent lifestyles. Now, the authors went as far as to argue that intelligence really determines one's opportunities for success. And when determining success, intelligence even overrides parents' education and income. Now, in the second part of the book, the authors go a step further and argue that intelligence accounts for behavioral differences between and among categories and groups of people. Essentially, they argued, Asian Americans and non-Hispanic whites tend to have IQs anywhere from 10 to 15 points higher than African Americans and Latinos. Now, it is this difference, they suggest, that explains unemployment, more educational failures, higher rates of poverty for African Americans and Latinos, as well as the fact that these categories tend to have more illegitimate children, higher levels of divorce and abandonment, poorer parenting skills, poorer job performance, as well as other social problems. Again, they attribute all of this to intelligence differences. Now, one way to kind of make sense of their point is to examine this. Now, what's kind of interesting is that Herrnstein and Murray focused on the fact that roughly 5% of the population is going to fall to the left. Now, the term they use to refer to folks in this category, very dull. There would be another 5% that they labeled as very bright. Now, 20% of the population falls into this category that they labeled, and keep in mind a lot of social scientists don't accept these particular labels, but they're referred to as dull. Okay? Whereas another 20% to the right, bright. Now, the normal range, this was their term, the normal range, roughly 50% of the population falls in here. Now, keep in mind, these are IQ scores that you see, but come down here and highlight again the points that they're kind of making. Notice again that folks with lower IQ scores, they argued, are going to be well overrepresented here. Okay? Many more of them living in poverty. They're also going to have lower standardized test scores. And they even went as far as to suggest that maybe it related to interpersonal skills like driving. Furthermore, their educational levels would be pretty low. Whereas if you move over to the right side, you notice significant differences. Now, they did acknowledge that during the 1970s and into the 1980s, the intelligence gap narrowed a bit. And they argued this was due in part to Head Start and other related programs. But then they went on to say that these programs have reached their limit. But they don't stop there. They assert that the low IQ underclass, represented over here, tends to have higher fertility rates than the high IQ elite over here. They go on to argue that since American society spends too much on children who have learning problems, and remember again their argument is these learning problems are kind of inborn or innate, and they spend too little on gifted children, and their gifted status is also innate or inborn. The authors both worried a great deal about the dumbing down of the country. Now, needless to say, critics have jumped all over many of the claims that Herrnstein and Murray made. For example, just several to keep in mind. Intelligence, some argue, is far more complex a variable and changeable than any single test score could ever suggest. For example, ranking people based upon IQ scores, does it tell you that much about their creative abilities, their practical sense, their social skill, as well as other qualities generally associated with intelligence? Further, another key criticism, IQ exams measure cultural knowledge more than innate ability. Put in another way, they measure mental achievement rather than mental capacity. Likewise, some critics are quick to point out that IQ examinations tend to be biased in favor of middle and upper class knowledge. Terms like regatta or aesthetics can put poor and minority students at a decided disadvantage. So again, rather than focusing on mental capacity, these exams focus more on mental achievement. Likewise, if these guys were correct in their argument that all this is innate and it's largely unchangeable, how do you account for the fact that average scores for racial and ethnic groups, that's IQ test scores, have changed rather significantly over time? Worldwide, the average IQ scores have risen over the last 70 years or so by as much as 15 points. Further, another argument or criticism is there's not that much evidence out there that IQ or other test scores will predict future success. There have been a number of studies, medical schools, law schools, psychology graduate students, and 3 different classes admitted to the Harvard Graduate School of Education over 30 years. What have these studies discovered? Little or no correlation between scores on standardized admission tests or exams and success in school or success in careers. Now, if you look at SAT and ACT IQ-based exams, they're still widely used by colleges and universities to evaluate students for admission. Some critics point out that these are really unfair. They're a type of institutionalized discrimination. Further, the critics argue they're really weak predictors of later academic success. Yet college admission programs continue to use them, giving the appearance anyway that admission decisions are based solely on merit. Actually, these exams are skewed in such a way that who benefits the most? The affluent. And these, again, disproportionately are white students. They typically do better on standardized tests of this nature than less affluent students. What are some of the reasons? Well, again, they're not personal. They tend out to be more social and cultural. First and foremost, no surprise to any of you, more affluent kids, generally speaking, are going to attend well-financed schools. They're more likely to get tutoring to do well on exams, and they grow up in homes that promote or encourage higher education. Now, there have been some other interesting studies as well. For example, that African Americans tend to score better on IQ examinations when the tests are administered not by whites, but by African Americans. Furthermore, other studies indicate that with specific programs, IQ scores can be improved. So in the end, why do some categories score lower on standardized tests to measure IQ? Well, think about that for just a moment and apply the sociological imagination. Specifically, why do minorities tend to score lower than non-Hispanic whites on standardized tests? Okay, well, most sociologists would argue the answer is sociological, not biological. For example, if you look around the world, there are categories of people. For example, the Scottish in Great Britain, the Maoris of New Zealand, and the Roma or Gypsies of several Eastern European countries. Generally speaking, again, they score lower on IQ scores, or tests to be precise, than do other categories of people within the populations of the country of which they are a part. This isn't a result of genetics or biology. It's related to a theme, a key theme that all share. They're all minorities. They're outside the cultural mainstream. So the point I want to drive home here is ethnic or racial groups' positions within society has a very significant impact on the measurements of intelligence, rather than the Herrnstein and Murray argument. If you remember in conclusion, They suggested that minorities, particularly African Americans and Hispanics, are going to be well overrepresented here, whereas here you're going to find primarily non-Hispanic whites and Asian Americans being overrepresented. But again, the key theme boils down to a great extent that it's not strictly biology that plays a role here. Social factors, cultural factors play a role. That's the essence, if you'll remember, of the sociological imagination or perspective. Focus on social locators. Focus on larger social factors. No one is suggesting, again, that individual factors don't figure in, but balance it by looking at social and cultural factors as well. We'll continue this discussion in the next wrap-up lesson. Until then.